And now I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Patricio Munoz, scientist and professor at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Patricio?
Hello, Bethany, and thanks for the organizer for inviting me to share our work of blueberries. So let me share my screen here and have it ready to go. So I imagine you can, in these moments, you can see my screen. Okay, I'm ready to go. So the idea today, I'm going to be talking to you about the history of blueberries and how blueberry in reality came to be. I'm also going to be talking about the impact that plant breeding has had in Florida and globally through the example of blueberry. We're going to be continue talking a little bit about our program, also about the methods of plant breeding that we're using today, how they are going to have been evolving, since the program started back in the 50s. And finally, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research that we do in our program. So let's go and let's start this presentation then. So we're going to be talking about high bush blueberry, and that's typically the blueberry that you eat for fresh, that you find in the supermarket in the fresh aisle. So let me tell you that how blueberries came to be domesticated and the impact that plant breeding has had in this domestication. Not every day we have the opportunity to have a crop that actually we can track every single step of the domestication and the breeding that has been done. So before the 1900s, blueberry could not be cultivated. And it was Dr. Coville, in the north, that was actually able, after many attempts to grow blueberry or domesticate blueberry, that actually the acid soils were the key to actually being able to propagate and maintain a good orchard. Then later he was working with Elizabeth White. They worked together actually to select the first cultivars, and the first cultivars of varieties of blueberry came directly from the wild, selections from the wild. So great, now we have blueberry growing in the north of the country. However, blueberry at that time could not be grown commercially in the south of the country, or specifically in Florida. So the main two issues that why blueberry could not be grown in Florida was the first one, the chilling requirements. Blueberry required a lot higher chilling that we could provide here, or the weather or the climate could provide here in Florida. So the chilling is the amount of hours that you need between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit for the plant to wake up, so it's basically to take out the plant out of dormancy. The second issue that we have at that time, it was pests and diseases that will eat the plant to the ground, literally. Fortunately, we have many different wild species in Florida, and here I'm showing some of them. And for example, you see the one down here, Vaccinum ashii, or also known as rabidite. It has the characteristics of the blueberries that you find in the market, and actually nowadays you also could find some of those in the supermarket. However, it didn't have the fruit quality characteristics that the market needed. So as you imagine, we have a northern high bush, the one that could be grown in the north, with large fruit and good quality, but it was not adapted to Florida. But in Florida, we did have, fruit that has a smaller fruit, but bushes or plants that were adapted to the climate that we have here. But they were not enough for the market. So the plant breeder started to work, as we usually do. So in that moment, they crossed the northern varieties with the southern ones to finally, and that was the work of Dr. Chalf, Wayne Sherman, and also George Darrow from the USDA, the first two from University of Florida. And basically that's how they developed what we know nowadays as Southern High Bush. So Southern High Bush, in summary, is the product of the hybridization of the northern varieties with higher fruit quality characteristics and better yields with the locally adapted species for Florida. And here I'm just using one of them, Vaccinum darrowi, but in reality there were many others used in this process. to form what we know nowadays as southern high bush. Southern high bush now then, it has low chill requirement. It could be cultivated through the whole south of the U.S. and all the way to California, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and actually all varieties grow all the way to North Carolina. And so it has greatly expanded the production around the whole country. So now we can say that we could, or in that time, we are talking about 1976, more or less, that blueberries could grow, or the traditional blueberries could grow in Florida. And with that, I can tell you that nowadays we have an industry that we have around 50 to 60 farms. This data is out of the survey that we in our program carry every single year after the season to find out what are the challenges that the producers face after each year season. We have around 5,400 acres, and we produce around, in average, 20 million pounds of fruit. And that's the first fruit that you eat in the season, the first fresh fruit produced in the country that you eat in the season. So basically that goes all the way from March to the beginning of May, more or less, is the season for Florida. So not only we expanded the production and we were able to produce a lot earlier fruit here in the US, but the creation of this new varietal, type, it was able to expand the production to subtropical and tropical areas around the whole globe. And that's been very relevant because the production of blueberries has been increasing steadily, all the way back from 2005, globally, and also here in the US. And that's why we, in particular here in the US, we eat a lot of blueberries. And so just to give you a reference, back in 2017, the US produced 40% of the global production, but we ate more than 60% of the whole blueberries they were producing globally. So there was a lot of imported blueberries, as you see, in the winter season, that we bring blueberries from all over the place. So the impact that this work done at the University of Florida by creating this new varietal type, it has huge impact nationally, but also internationally. So in this context, the University of Florida developed this new varietal type. They released the first cultivar in 1976. Also discovered and released the first crunchy or crispy type in 1997, and others later on. Also released, varieties that were able to create whole industry in different countries around the globe. Discover and release aromatic types, also with global impact. Release of cultivars with machine harvest capacity, and which is one of the biggest issues for the fruit industry, the lack of labor, of the increased cost of labor. And then I can tell you that currently, more than 70% of the global southern high bush cultivars, they link to our pedigree here at the University of Florida, and they link 1 or 2 generations, up to 3 generations removed only. So this is all very recently. The University of Florida has released more than 100 varieties in total, and as you see, it's a steady production of new varieties. Our focus is local, but our impact is global. How we do that, how we develop new varieties, we use in this, what you can see here is the pedigree, or basically each of the lines, how the different selections connect, and the blue ones are different cultivars that have been developed. And this is the pedigree, basically, how the crosses are made to develop new varieties. The traditional methodology of crossing and selecting the best progeny is, as you see here, basically, you emasculate the flowers, and then you use pollen of the parental type that you want to use into the maternal flower, as is shown here by Dr. Paul Lyrine, which is what's instrumental in the creation of many of the varieties I just mentioned. After you obtain these plants, they are put in the field, as you see here. So this is a traditional methodology. And then they are evaluated for yield, quality, disease resistance, and all the other characteristics that we look at. And then we move forward to select the best one to be cultivars for the commercial industry. So as I showed before, the crosses are done, the plants are put in the field. So here I'm going to just show you how the selection process more or less happens and how it has evolved through time with the use of different methodologies. So once the plants are in the field, we usually observe the characteristics. And then in the past, back to 2017, most of the evaluations were done visual for characteristics like yield, quality, and disease resistance. And then based on that, there was selection based on visual aspects. Then the plants were ranking depending on the visual aspect again of all these characteristics. And then crosses were made among the best ones for the different characteristics. And then this process goes again. Now, the use of visual evaluation, it has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that you can evaluate many characteristics simultaneously. The disadvantage is that it's not very accurate. However, after many generations of doing this, you usually end up releasing cultivars no matter what. And the other disadvantage of this process is it's very long. I mean, since the crosses are made originally, as you see here in year 0, it takes up to 15 years actually to commercialize the first variety out of those crosses. In our case, we do this every single year. So that's why we have a pipeline that I was showing you before, that we are able to release many cultivars over time. Now, has this been impactful? Oh, yes. It's slow, but it's been impactful. So here what you can see in this axis, in the y-axis, you can see the firmness of the fruit. In the x-axis, you can see the year of release of the different cultivars. So this is a review that we did to determine what was the impact of plant breeding in the firmness of the fruit. And we can see in red all the northern high bush, remember the ones that could not be grown in Florida. And then actually some of the original ones selected from the wild to be cultivars. And in blue, you can see the southern high bush, the ones that we work here, and how, around 1976, by the time that these were first released, and at the same time, some of the northern high bush, the ones from the north, they also increase significantly in the firmness of the fruit. And that has a huge impact because our consumers, the two characteristics that they look in the blueberries is flavor and firmness or texture of the fruit. Between 2017 and 2019, we changed the strategy for doing selection. And then I'm going to show you here. Even when the selection methodology might change, we still put the plants in the field and they still need to be evaluated in the traditional way. The only difference here is that the characteristics now were quantified, so measured basically. And then with those measurements, we were able to estimate the much better, with better accuracy, the different characteristics. We were estimate better, what portion of this variability that we observe is due to the genetics per se, or which one is due to the environmental conditions. Based on that, we can obtain what we call breeding values, and we use the breeding value prediction actually to determine which parents should be used for the next generation of crosses. And the process goes again. Now, the idea and the goal here is that this is going to provide us a faster way to release cultivars in this process. Another way to do selection of the plants is a method that nowadays we call genomic selection, that in reality is called genomic prediction. So we use genomic information or molecular marker information to determine what are the best individuals to use as parents, and to shorten it also the process of development of new cultivars. In this process, so similar as before, we have a field of plants. We also measure the different traits that we are interested, but simultaneously, we obtain molecular markers for every plant that we have in the field that we have evaluated. Using now the information of the characteristic that we measure, plus the genomic information, basically they are molecular markers across the whole genome, we use that to even more accurately determine, rank our parents, rank our populations, and determine which ones are the best ones to use as parents. They are going to pass these best characteristics to the next generation. The idea with this methodology is to accelerate even more the process of plant breeding and the process of developing new cultivars. So after saying that, I just cover a little bit of more or less how the plant breeding and the different ways, more traditional ways, if we can say it, and the genomic selection is probably considered nowadays a more modern way to do plant breeding. So I just want to tell you a little bit what do we do. So we also, in the traits that we look at, that we're trying to improve, are the traditional traits that probably every breeding program tries to improve, which is yield, quality, and resistance to pest diseases. We also try to use and develop methodologies to accelerate the development of cultivars using genomic information, or these molecular marks that exist in the genome of every plant. We also try to adapt the development of new cultivars to new production systems, as I'm going to show you in a second. Try to develop cultivars for machine harvest to try to solve the problems of shortage of labor and increasing the cost of labor. And then we work very hard also in flavor and aroma of blueberries. And we continue working, like in 1950, we continue working heavily on the use of wild species in our program, because they provide variety of different new characteristics that they don't exist nowadays in the market. So just to show you a little bit what I'm talking about. So this is, for example, a new production system where the plants, instead of being in the open field, they are produced in these containers and under these high tunnels, and then we can obtain as to high times the yield in the first year compared with the open field. We continue working in machine harvest because the cost of machine harvest is significantly lower than domestic labor, so it's half of the domestic labor, and it's actually a lot more, it decreased significantly compared with imported labor. When I'm talking about imported labor, is this special temporary visa that are given to workers to come here and harvest the fruit. And we need to compete, with our neighboring countries that they have a much lower cost for labor. So back in 2017, we released the first cultivars. Actually, they can be machine harvest for fresh consumers. And it's being adopted as we speak. Another trait that we work significantly, as I mentioned before, is flavor and aroma. Flavor is a complex characteristic that is composed of two different parts. The first one is where your tongue is able to taste, which is traditional sugar, acids, umami, salty, and I'm missing one that I don't remember right now. But also the volatile components. Whenever you eat the fruit, a lot of the volatile components go through the back of your mouth and they go to your sensors in your brain. And that actually, this combination offers the possibility to select for thousands or millions of combinations of different characteristics of flavors in blueberries. So we have made significant progress in this area. For example, we can predict which blueberry is going to be the most liked by our consumers. And this is all research that we have performed in our lab. Traditionally, up to probably a couple of years ago, most of the focus in blueberries has been in sugar and acid. But we were able to demonstrate that only 40% of the variability that we observe in flavors comes from sugar and acid. And most of the variability comes from these metabolites or volatile components that provide this myriad of different characteristics in blueberries. Another characteristic that it was started to study back in 2013, and then now we're putting a lot more effort, is the capacity to observe aromatic components in blueberries that we already shown that they are more accepted and more liked by our consumer. So we are working in releasing new varieties with this characteristic as well. And as I mentioned before, It's been very important for us to the use of wild species, because thanks to wild species, we're able to develop the cultivars or the varieties that we have nowadays. So this is a different wild species as the ones that was used in the past. So this is Vaccinium eliotii, and this is how naturally you observe it in the field. Using traditional methodologies of plant breeding, we were able to duplicate the genome of this species, and then we already observe an increase in the fruit size. And then through hybridization, we can observe that by the backcross one, basically 3-4 generations after the first plant was selected from the wild, we were able to incorporate the characteristics of this wild species into the southern high bush, into the commercial one. What is this important? Because these wild species are able to offer us many agronomical and sensorial characteristics that we don't observe nowadays in the commercial production. So with that, and for us it's very important, blueberry came to be because in part of the healthy characteristics that offered to our consumers. And that's why we see a huge increase in consumption. So we just always have to say, stay healthy and eat blue. You can find more information about blueberries and how to grow blueberries in this publication that is in our webpage as well. And also you can find a lot more information about our program, our team, the research we do, and all the cultivars that we have released as a program, and also extension work through Doc's blog. This is our extension specialist in this webpage, which is blueberrybreeding.com. And also you can follow me on Twitter at bberrybreeding, where I post all the information and I've been talking about. So thanks to our sponsors and for you to listen, and I'll be very happy to answer questions if you have some.
Thanks, Patricio. That's really interesting stuff, and we'll definitely be following you on Twitter. We have a couple questions that have come in. The first one is, are consumers' tastes changing? And if so, how have you changed your breeding programs to adapt?
That's very, very interesting. You know, I was just before this meeting, I was discussing with some colleagues about this. Consumers change demographically. So different consumers in different parts of the globe wants different things. But one thing is common. Nobody wants, you know, bad texture in the fruit. Some people likes a little bit better, a little bit more acid, or less acidity, depending on the demographic. But nobody wants mealy fruit, that's for sure. Now, here in the US again, it consumes most of the blueberries that are produced globally. And the consumer is very traditional because it's been eating blueberries since the beginning of the days. You know, most people harvesting the blueberries from the wild. So our consumers, I will say, they are more traditional and they are more used to the traditional flavors of blueberries. But if you see, for example, in the case of grapes, that you can now go to the grape aisle in the supermarket and you see all these novel flavors and all these novel shapes, and the consumers adapt. The consumer, when you offer something that it tastes good, and actually they have a good experience with this new product, they're gonna use it. They're gonna consume it.
Great, thank you. You mentioned acidity. Is there any work being done to grow blueberries in less acidic soil?
That's something that people has been working. We are not working directly on that right now. So as we select what traits we work on, we usually select the traits that they are more impactful for our producers. So again, we carry a whole survey of every single producer that we can reach across the whole state. Based on that, we sort the challenges our producers have, and we direct our strategies for genetic improvement in our program. Acidity is not an issue because actually injecting acid, while the irrigation system, you need to have an irrigation system, but injecting of acid into the irrigation is not an expensive procedure for our producers. There is a lot more, challenge, higher priority challenge that our producers have than the acidity at this point.
Okay. Have you seen changing environment conditions like climate impacting blueberries over the years, and is breeding being used to respond to that, and how?
Yes, that's right. And that's been very impactful, actually. So if you imagine, I was showing you before the map for chilling hours. In the past, in this part of the state, we were able to obtain up to, 300-400 chill hours. So that means in the winter time, we were able to observe, 300 or 400 hours under 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Nowadays, that's been decreasing significantly, which affects the production of blueberries, basically the yield or productivity of blueberries. Now, in our case, I will say that we are better prepared than anybody in this sense, because we grow blueberries all the way from central South Florida to North Carolina. So the selections that they have been performing in the central South, or the most southern part of the production area, are being able to adapt very well to the central part of the state. And if these trends continue, probably in the future we might be using them here in the north part of the state.
Thank you. Another question that just came in is about protecting IP. For example, is vegetative multiplication possible? Can you speak to that?
Yes, sure. So me as the plant breeder, and other 30 or so plant breeders here at the University of Florida, we work in the development of the varieties. Once these varieties are developed, there is a different office in the university that is in charge of the protection and the IP. So these varieties, and is the only sustainable way that we have to support breeding in public institutions, is to license these varieties and being able to obtain royalties that they were used for continued genetic improvement that benefits our local producers.
Thank you. Another question that just came in: what are the production levels like for the southern high bush blueberries versus the northern wild blueberries?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes. What are the production levels like for the southern high bush blueberries versus the northern wild blueberries?
Production levels was there? I'm not sure what do they mean by production? I mean, comparison of production, productivity, yield. I will not have an idea how to compare with. I mean, if we are talking about the northern high bush, the high bush that is commercially produced in the north part of the country, they usually yield more because the characteristics are better. I mean, while we are able to produce first and we produce good fruit quality, the reality is that Florida is a pretty harsh environment to grow almost anything. And that's why our varieties, once we develop the varieties under this condition, they work very well in other places. They don't have such harsh conditions, Imagine humidity, heat, all the diseases and pests that we are able to attract here to the state. So whatever survive here usually do much better in other places. Now, compared with the north, I mean, and just to give you an idea, the plantings here in the state, they don't last more than 10 to 12 years. While in the north, using the northern high bush, the plantings could be up to 50 years. So that's a huge impact. Why? Because the conditions are very harsh here in the state. So, but those are the northern high bush that I'm talking about nowadays. Those are also genetically improved. They are not the wild ones anymore. So there also has been a lot of improvement in the northern varieties for use in commercial production by our north producers.
Thanks. I don't see any questions at this point, but I'll give it a minute in case anyone thinks of anything else. So I'll just ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing blueberry production as you look out maybe in the next 5 years, 10 years? What are you working towards right now?
I think probably two things, as I mentioned before. Labor is a big issue for any produce, any fruit or vegetable that needs labor for commercial harvest or for any other activity. I see the major issue that I see for us is that the machines that we are using nowadays, they are not the best ones for what we need them to be. Well, they are not up to the standards that we need them to be. That's the issue. So we're still able to harvest. We can harvest our very best cultivars for those firmness characteristics. However, we need the technology, the machine robotic technology to improve. And that's something that we can now work on. So we can work in improving the plants, and then we have other people that works in improving machines. And that's what is needed nowadays in our case. The second one is flavor and aroma, is the, our capacity to select new flavors, novel flavors and aroma. And I believe they are going to be well accepted by your consumers.
Great, thank you. We did have another question come in. Can you tell us a little bit more about molecular breeding? What exactly is that, and how is it being used in blueberries?
So molecular breeding, and that's one of the classes I teach here in the university, is composed of different things. Probably the traditional one that has been used up to now is the use of molecular markers to perform selection. Just to give you an analogy, sometimes you guys read in the newspaper that there is a new gene that is being found that is correlated, for example, with diabetes. Okay? So that means that if you have one variant of that gene, you potentially could have diabetes. So if you are in that category, you need to take care of more of yourself, right? So the same thing happens with plants. So we do a study to identify what genes are correlated with the different characteristics. And then in the process of selection, we use those molecular markers of the selection for those genes, right? To select the plants that we're going to be using for making crosses and the ones that we're going to be moving forward. That's the traditional way. And what we call marker-assisted selection. A new form of marker-assisted selection started in the 2000s when somebody proposed that no matter what the genes are associated with, if we can just use these molecular markers across all the genome to predict what is going to be the performance of the plants in the field, then in reality, we don't care about the specific function of the genes. We only want to predict. So that's what I was showing you before, is genomic selection. In that methodology, we are not changing anything in the genome of the plants. The only thing is that we are using all the genes simultaneously to create a prediction model to predict what is going to be the performance for the different traits that we're interested. And then we use those models and those rankings to select these plants for use as parents or to move them forward in the process. Another form of molecular breeding probably could be the use of transgenics, or the use of genome editing. But I think my colleague Fred Gamater is going to be talking more about that tomorrow.
Thank you. It was a really good explanation. And yes, I think that Fred will be covering that in a little more detail tomorrow. Another question is about pollinators. Are there different pollinators needed for the cultivars you create? And do you import pollinators?
So pollination and cross-pollination is very important in blueberry. It's actually needed. We don't recommend our producers to use cross-pollination. That means that you have to have more than one cultivar in the field at this point. There is not enough research to support that you need to plant a single block of cultivars. Even when it's done, we don't support that. And that's why we need the cross-pollination. The pollinators that we use traditionally are bees. Bees are not very efficient in the pollinations of blueberry, but still, our producers are the ones that, you have available actually for renting. So you can rent bees and put in your fields. And I believe there is enough here in the state for the production area that we have. I don't think that we import from other states, but I might be mistaken. I might not have managed all the information. The other pollinators that we have are native pollinators, and also bumblebees are way more efficient. One visit of bumblebees is equivalent to 5 or 6 visits of honeybees to the single flower. And that's what is needed more or less for the flower to produce a good blueberry. Lack of pollination affects yield and affects fruit quality, and also affects flavor and times of production. So pollination is very, very important, and we do a lot of work with our colleagues in entomology with pollination of blueberries.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions that I see for now. I really appreciate your time, Patricio. It's really interesting stuff.
Of course.
And if any of you think of questions that you didn't have a chance to ask, feel free to send those in, and we'll work with Patricio to get those answers back to you offline. But thanks again.